Welcome. You have found Why We Are Christians. I'm Katrina Pierce, and I'm here today with Brian Bailey, who will
Hello.
be finding out a little bit about how he became a Christian in our first half, and then we'll be getting a little bit more in depth in our second half. So make sure to stay tuned for both. So Brian, welcome. It's great to have you here
Thank you.
today,
Yes,
and I know Brian is our Skype guest. He's coming to us from Tallahassee, Florida.
that's right.
I would like to start by kind of getting oriented with you and
Okay. Um, I grew up essentially in Tallahassee. I was born in Massachusetts. When I was just about to turn 6, my family moved down here to Tallahassee. My father starting a new business venture, and so I grew up here in the early 60s and 70s in Tallahassee. Of course, it was a much smaller, more intimate southern community then, much larger, more cosmopolitan today, but it was a great place to grow up.
good. So it's still home to you. That's have you
Yes,
that's
yes.
good. You must love it there.
Yeah, I do very much.
So
Still have family here.
your parents so you said that you weren't born there. Were your parents from somewhere else? Where were they from?
My parents were born near Birmingham. Industry. He sold supplies to the miners, and so they both grew up in that type of a community in the rural South in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, and that was their background. Living in a small community, they knew each other really from a very early age. And when they were young, my father just graduating from high school, they decided that they wanted to get married, and they did. And about that time, my father was drafted into the Army to participate in World War II, and he went overseas. Matter of fact, he turned 20 years old about the time that he was actually going into France to fight with Patton's army. And mother was home working in the industries that provided war background before my siblings and myself came along until the war itself actually ended.
Wow. So that was they've been through a lot. That had to
Yes, yes.
So they had you, and were you an only child, or did you have siblings?
I have two older brothers that were born in Bessemer. And about the time that I was to be born, the family moved up north with my father's work. So I was born up there. So consequently, I was forever known as the Yankee in the family.
Lucky you.
Yeah, yeah. So, but of course, being raised in the heritage of a family that had come from the South, I still am seeped in the culture and the
Your parents, were they religious? Did you grow up going to church or being exposed to that?
yes.
Um, what kind of religion were you exposed to when you were young?
I was exposed to the Baptist church, which is what my parents grew up in. Uh, and I have early memories of going to church. Matter of fact, I have a vague memory of going to church when we were up in Massachusetts. I couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old, where we were worshiping, I think, in the old Hingham Church, which is the oldest church building in the United States. And I
Oh,
remember it because the pews were squares. Children from wandering, and they could have some privacy in the pew, even though
huh.
they could all still, of course, hear the service going on. Mother and Dad looked at a few different churches. They even actually looked at one or two other churches from another denomination, but ultimately ended up at First Baptist Church, Tallahassee, Florida, which I was there, I guess I would say from the time I was about 8 years old. We were going there on a regular basis, and our family joined. As a matter of fact, my father just celebrated his 50th anniversary of being a member in the church.
Oh, wow.
So,
It really becomes like a second family to you then.
right, right,
Yeah. I'm
right. And uh, so I have a lot of good. I did actually when I became a teenager. That's where all my friends were. So I wanted to go hang out with my friends. That was part of it. So we'd all go
huh.
hang out at church on Sunday night and go out and do things. And it was a real good network and community.
So it must have been a big church where there was a lot of, it depends on the church, but I know some are small and don't necessarily
Yes.
have that sense. But,
Good size.
and it's also transformed over the years as well. I mean, that was,
Yeah. Yeah.
that was a while ago when it was
Yeah.
maybe a bigger group that went, and that's pretty neat. All your friends, so a lot of your friends you met there, created there, and that's where you went to hang
Absolutely.
out.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's just different from, a lot of things now, and I'm sure that that's still the case in some places, but it's just neat to hear that. That's all.
Well, it was a good experience. I first wanted to learn more about the Bible. I wanted to learn more about what the Bible said. I remember that we had a children's book, and it was an older book, it was of Bible stories. And I just devoured it because I thought it was fascinating to read it and read the history and see all the people's lives and stories that were contained in it. And so that really kind of gripped me. And God used all of that in my life at a fairly young age, by some standards, to spark the interest, to cause me to look at the Bible and say, okay, what is this saying here? What does this mean? What do I need to do in response to this?
So you were hungry to. I mean, interesting to you at that time. It
Right.
was, and so did you, I mean, you read the Bible stories. Did you read the Bible? Did you, memorize the books? And did you, I mean, how
No.
how were you just fascinated about the stories? I mean, there's a lot of action stories.
Right.
There's a lot
Right.
of history too, and for a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, you could really just, a lot of those things you would think might just go over your head. So that's, I mean, that's pretty mature reading for for that age. Beyond the stories, which I know there are a lot of Bible stories that I remember reading at that age that were
Right.
fascinating and interesting, but you were able to get through the Bible at that age?
Most of it. I mean, there were parts of it that I did not read because, sure, some of it was over my head and I
Sure.
didn't understand it at all. But what I did understand made a difference. What I did understand became a part of my life, and it colored how I began to look at life and how I began to look at myself and develop an understanding of even as a young person, okay, the questions that we ask often through life: why am I here? What am I supposed to do? Is there a God? Does God have a plan for my life? All of those great questions that we ask in life, yes, all that was in the mix. It was all coming in there over time. And I felt, based upon what I was fortunate to have as a background in terms of family and in terms of church, I felt that ultimately the answers for me were going to be found in the Bible itself, not in some other religious experience or anything like that. I never went through that phase where some people go through a phase in life where they want to look at other religions and other areas of faith. I never had that desire
That
or
pull
sense.
on you, yeah.
No, I never had that.
You were content. So it must have
Yes.
been also very, content in your home. Would you say that it was? Or how was living at home with your
Oh,
brothers and
I was
sisters,
so
or
lucky,
your
so
brothers and
blessed.
parents? Were they
Yeah.
all, I mean, would you read the Bible with the family? Did you pray together? What was it like?
It was we were a Christian family, but interestingly enough, we didn't spend a lot of time together in prayer, which was kind of one of the oddities of our family. Mother and dad, although they had a very strong connectedness to faith, were not ones to really try to talk a lot about it. Um, they lived it. Is what they sought to do as best they could. They sought to live what they believed, and they sought to demonstrate to us as their sons what we should do in our lives. Now they weren't perfect. They had their failings, and their faith grew over time. They always were supportive of us. They always wanted to encourage us to look into matters of faith. But some parents tend to push their children
Yeah.
and put a lot of pressure on them in terms of faith. And they were more hands off than that. They were their own unique people. But for us, for me, it worked.
Well, that's good. They led by example, it sounds like, and they didn't. It wasn't something that was forced on you. It was something that you were exposed to and you were curious about. So it sounds
Right,
like
right.
it made you a little bit more curious because of that, because it
Right.
was of your own free will.
Yeah, they were supportive. I was so fortunate to grow up in a time. I was talking to my dad about this the other day, as a matter of fact. My dad is still alive. He's 92 years old. My mother passed away 6 years ago. And talking to dad, just grateful for what he and mother gave us in our lives. They loved us. They loved us greatly. They let us be ourselves. They didn't expect us to be perfect. My mother, it's funny, was one of five girls, and she didn't try to turn us into girls. I've known I've known families that have done that. She let us be boys, and
She was
Lord
okay
knows
with
we
that.
were. Yeah, I know at times we had. I just don't know how she stood it, because we were all boy. We were into everything, but we lived at a time where children could be out and basically roam the neighborhood and be free and not worry about anything. Such a different day to day than what we had.
So where are your brothers at now? Are they? Do you keep in touch with them?
Well, we're all here in Tallahassee.
Oh, you are still your brothers as well.
Right, and we haven't wandered far from the apple tree, so to speak. But there are reasons for that. One, we love the community. We have deep roots here. Our father's still here. We are involved with him, all of us, on a regular basis, trying to help him as he's in his later years. And dealing still, he still has that sense of the loss of mother. They were married for 67 years.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, there's still that sense of part of him is gone. And so we're trying to support him and love him and be with him in this time and let him know that he's loved and valued.
Has he always been a rock for you, or was there, someone else that was always someone that you could go to ask questions about?
There were things that I could talk to Mother and Dad about, but also there were many people that God, I think, placed in my life along the way, the right people at the right times to help in the faith journey. People to encourage and to love and to instruct, and there was no one person. Certainly, I mentioned in some of the notes that you had about one of the pastors that we had at First Baptist when I was a teenager, Dr. McMillan. Dr. McMillan was probably one of the most brilliant men I've ever known. He was a superb Bible scholar. He had his PhD in counseling, so he was a brilliant, wise, and intelligent man, and a marvelous theologian. And so he always impressed on me, get into the scriptures, learn what it says, dive into it, let it soak into you, and don't be satisfied with pat answers. Learn it properly and correctly. And the impact of that was just tremendous.
Because if you don't have like someone physically around you, you always have the Bible and that you can go back to for a reference. Right. And I know at times, sometimes I will just open it randomly and I need something, and sometimes just reading anything in it will feed you something. And
right.
Anyway, that's interesting that you say that there are people placed in your life. I know a lot of people probably have that happen and might not even realize it. So it's always something for everyone to kind of be aware of, that he's trying to take care of everybody and placing people strategically in everyone's life. So
absolutely, he meets the needs, and I'll tell you a story. There's a fella that when I was in college, was a few years younger than I was, that I did some mentoring for. He was in high school, I was in college, and I was just a clueless college student in so many ways. There are just so many things about life and that I just didn't understand because I just didn't have the life experience. But I spent a lot of time with Brian. He has the same name as I do. He just spells with a Y. And we would just do things together, and I just try to be there. And I never really felt like I did him a lot of good, so to speak, but some years later, we reconnected on Facebook, and he said to me, I want to thank you for what you meant to me. You really helped me in a lot of ways in a very difficult time in my life with my family. I had no clue.
That's what a compliment.
No, I didn't see that, but it meant something to him. And so there are people that that God places us in their lives that we can have great effect on, that we may never fully understand this side of glory. But when we get into the next life, then we might find some connections and some blessings that we have provided for others that we just have no idea.
I think so many times we're focused on the blessings that we do provide, but it's really neat to hear you just remind us that we can be a blessing to
Yeah.
the world and other people just by, just by being true to yourself, and
Yeah.
that's a really great compliment and so encouraging to just continue on. That's just so encouraging.
Yeah.
Was it somebody that you were able to, share faith with in that way, or was it a friendship that
It was
you
more
were?
of a friendship. It was something that we were doing in the college ministry at the time, basically trying to be friends with some of the young high school kids. And so you would have high school students that would pair with young people and just basically try to be just be there for them and be a friend.
Was
And
he aware, or is he now of your faith? Is that
oh, absolutely.
is
I
that
mean, God has really worked in his life in wonderful ways. He's a faithful man. He's raising his family for Christ. So, in spite of some of my failings at times and so forth, God still has worked in his life to really bring him to a point to where he truly is a faithful believer.
so? Maybe you were acting in a role that kind of like your parents do, where they have acted as an example, and
Perhaps.
instead
Yeah.
of openly witnessing, you were witnessing
Yeah.
through yourself just by being the person that you are.
Yeah, I just didn't, I just didn't know. I just didn't understand that it was meaningful to him until
Yeah,
all these years later.
yeah.
So it's kind
So
of kind
that's
of neat.
I am curious about your college. I know that you're still working on something now,
Right.
but tell us about where you went to college and what you went for originally.
Well, I went to the premier college in Florida, which is Florida State University. That's I'm kind of throwing a barb at University of Florida there. But I went to Florida State University and graduated with a degree in education. And I taught for a few years. Also spent a lot of years in both private business and the public sector. And so by temperament, I'm more comfortable being a teacher and a writer, but I did not do that professionally. So, in a lot of ways, over the years, there was a lot of frustration because I felt at times I was a round peg being pushed into a square hole. But God had his purposes in that, and it provided for me and for the family. So that was his work in my life. It wasn't what I would have wanted, but that's what he chose. And the wherewithals and the whys, I'll guess I'll just have to see when I talk to him face to face. So,
Yeah, what were you doing with me there?
yeah, because I don't know, but there are those aspects of our lives where we just have to walk by faith.
Right, right. Yeah,
Um,
you just have to trust and
right,
continue
right,
on.
yeah.
So you mentioned writing a little bit, and I know that you do have a book which we'll talk about in the second half. So you have accomplished some writings. Have you? How much and what do you write?
I have written 5 books, and I am actually working on doing a rewrite of the first book that I wrote, simply because I want to do it over.
you you want to edit yourself.
Right. It's
You've have new findings.
I want to do over here. But no, it's just that in this particular book, having studied the material a bit more deeply over the years since I wrote the original book, there are just parts of it I'd like to bring out that I think can be meaningful and helpful to others that didn't occur the first time around. So the book has not now gone out of print, so I can do with it that
Sure.
way now if I wish. So
Make it fresh again.
Right, I'll try to freshen it up and hopefully write a better book.
Well, I know this book that you've written, the one that I have here, your most recent, I believe, is about the story of Joseph, and
Yes.
we'll get into that, like I said, in the second half of our program. But are your other books also based on Bible stories or Bible, people that have history that have been mentioned in the Bible, or are they of other topics as well?
The first book was on the character of Ruth in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth. The other books have been essentially a compilation of essays and other writings, more of a devotional or short essay type.
Okay, all right, good. Well, I'm glad that you've gotten a chance to expand on that, and now I'm sure that you are very busy while you're still pursuing your theology major as well.
Right.
So you're probably very busy. And I know we have just a couple minutes left, and we'll get into some further along on your journey and some, I guess, times that have been challenging for you, and I would just want to encourage people that are still watching to go ahead and make sure to find our second half of this, because we'll get into a little bit more on some issues that have made it trying on your faith, and how you've gotten through with that, and maybe some times that you've strayed. And I know that those are all things that a lot of us deal with.
I would say simply this, that I would encourage people that are Christians, that are seeking to be engaged in the world and seeking to be engaged in the lives of people around them. A lot of Christians put a lot of pressure on themselves to try to have all the answers and be able to answer all of the questions that people may pose. And what people really remember is not necessarily the answers that we have to their questions. What people remember and what really resonates is us loving them in Christ and loving them as people and valuing them as people and seeking to be there and be a part of their lives. That is what really resonates with people.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for joining us. This is Why
Thank
We
you.
Are Christians, and we will be tuned in for our second half shortly.